For my entire life, I've been the keeper of a terrible secret, one that was locked away in a silent room while I was locked away in a silent house. Now the key is in my hand, and the truth is about to burn down everything you think you know about power, family, and the price of a perfect name. This is the story of how I destroyed the man who stole my life, and I'm going to tell you every single detail. If you believe that secrets should never stay buried, then follow my story, like, share, and comment with your thoughts. And make sure you press that notification bell, because the whole rotten truth is coming out, and you won't want to miss a moment. I am 85 years old. My world, once expansive with the foolish dreams of youth, has now shrunken to the dimensions of this house. Here, in the perpetually damp quiet of Havenwood, Oregon, the walls have become my skin, and the scent of pine and wet earth is the only perfume I know. It seeps through the window frames, a constant cloying reminder of the world outside, a world I only observe through glass. My great-granddaughter, Lily, is the only real color in my monochrome existence. She has eyes that haven't yet learned to look away from uncomfortable truths. Yesterday, those bright, curious eyes fixed on me, and she asked a question that unlatched a door I had bolted shut 69 years ago. We were upstairs, her small hand in my wrinkled one, when she pointed a chubby finger down the long, dim hallway. "Grand Freya," she said, her voice a little bell in the oppressive silence. "Why is that door always locked?" She was pointing to the door at the very end of the hall, the one with the tarnished brass knob and the keyhole that has been dark for decades. "What's inside?" A practiced lie slipped from my lips as easily as a breath. "Just old things, darling. Fragile things." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, because I was lying. Inside that room is not a collection of things, but a collection of years. My years, an entire lifetime of my own, locked away, preserved in a vacuum of dust and silence, just like the rows upon rows of porcelain dolls that line the shelves within. They sit there, in their lace and satin, their painted smiles frozen, their glass eyes staring into a darkness they share with me. Looking at Lily's innocent, expectant face, the memory I had so carefully quarantined came rushing back. It wasn't a gentle tide of nostalgia, it was a flash flood, a wall of icy water that stole my breath and left me gasping in the silent hallway of my own mind. The memory of a key, heavy and cold, turning in that very lock, not to protect what was inside, but to imprison it, to imprison me. That memory pulled me back, yanking me through time to my 16th year. Back then, the Walker name wasn't just a name, it was an institution in Havenwood. It meant history, an unimpeachable legacy of wealth, and above all, a carefully constructed image of integrity. Our family home wasn't just a house, it was a monument to that image, a fortress of propriety. My father, Alistair Walker, was the chief architect and warden of that fortress. He wasn't a man so much as a statue carved from granite and disappointment. He was cold, imposing, and moved through our lives with a rigid purpose that left no room for error or emotion. His obsession, the altar upon which he sacrificed everything, was our family's unbroken lineage. He spoke of it constantly, his voice a low, dry rustle, as if he were reading from a sacred text. He would trace the family tree in the great book in his study, his finger tapping on names from centuries past, each one a testament to the purity and strength of the Walker blood. My mother, Eleanor, was his shadow. A beautiful, fragile woman whose spine had long been removed and replaced with silent, unshakable compliance. She glided through the house like a ghost, her only purpose to be a silent echo of my father's will. I often wondered if she had ever had a thought that was truly her own, or if her mind was simply a pristine, empty room waiting for my father to furnish it with his decrees. And then there was Silas, my older brother, to the town, to our parents, to the entire world. He was the golden sun. He was the sun around which the Walker legacy was destined to orbit. He was handsome, radiating a charm so potent it was almost a physical force. He was the heir to our father's throne, and he wore the title with an easy, confident grace. But to me, he was the keeper of a different kind of secret. He was the flaw in the family's perfect porcelain facade. I saw what no one else did, or perhaps what no one else wanted to see. He had our father's burning ambition, but none of his icy restraint. His smile was a performance, a dazzling curtain that never quite concealed the darkness behind it. It never, ever reached his eyes. In their cool, calculating depths, I saw something predatory, a hunger that I was too young to properly name but old enough, and female enough, to fear with every fiber of my being. He was a storm gathering on the horizon, and I was the only one watching the sky. In a house built on the foundation of image, I was the only one who sensed the tremors of the truth, the deep foundational crack that was about to shatter everything. The shattering happened on a humid summer night, the kind where the air becomes a thick, heavy blanket that smothers sound and makes it difficult to breathe. The world outside was buzzing with the drone of cicadas, a frantic, desperate sound that seemed to mimic the beating of my own heart. My parents were out, attending a town council dinner where my father would undoubtedly hold court, reinforcing the myth of the benevolent Walkers. The house, usually so full of unspoken tensions, was unnervingly quiet. I had sought refuge in the library, the one room where I felt a semblance of peace. The scent of old paper and leather was a comfort, and the stories on the shelves were my only escape. I was lost in a book, the world of its pages far more real than the silent, looming house around me. That's when Silas came in. The gentle click of the door latch was like a gunshot in the stillness. I looked up and he was standing there, leaning against the doorframe, silhouetted by the dim hallway light. He had been out, and he smelled of whiskey, a scent I'd grown to associate with a specific kind of recklessness in him, and something else, a cloying, proprietary cologne that seemed to cling to the heavy air. He smiled that smile, the one that was all teeth and no warmth. "Reading again, little sister," he murmured, his voice smoother than usual, coated with a layer of something I didn't trust. He didn't use force, not at first. He was smarter than that. Brute force was for common criminals, and Silas considered himself royalty. He used words, weaving them around me like a spider's silk, each strand sticky and impossible to break. He walked over to the armchair where I sat, and instead of taking the one opposite, he perched on the arm of mine, his presence an immediate, suffocating invasion of my small sanctuary. He spoke of my duty. He told me how I was special, different from the vapid, giggling girls in town who had nothing to offer the world but a pretty face. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. "We're different, Freya," he said, his gaze intense. "You and I, we share something no one else on earth can ever understand." His hand came to rest on my shoulder, a gesture that might have looked brotherly to an outsider, but the pressure of his fingers was too firm, a brand of ownership. "We have the same perfect blood, the same legacy running through our veins. It's a sacred thing." He was twisting our father's obsession into something monstrous, something personal and perverse. He was taking the family doctrine and corrupting it for his own use. He made my growing fear sound like childishness, my revulsion like ignorance. He painted a picture where this act, the one he was leading up to, was not a violation but a consecration, an essential ritual to honor the purity of our lineage. He made me feel as if my resistance was a betrayal of our sacred bond, of the very blood that made us Walkers. He twisted my fear into a dizzying state of confusion, my desperate, frozen silence into a form of consent. When he finally pushed me back into the chair, the library, my sanctuary, became a sacrificial altar. The abuse wasn't just an act of violence. It was a sermon of possession. In the oppressive, sticky heat of that summer night, with the frantic sound of the cicadas as our only witness, Silas was anointing me into a twisted faith of his own making, and my silent, suffocating terror was the holy water. He whispered our family name like a prayer as he broke me, claiming not just my body, but my very identity as his own. The humid summer gave way to a crisp, melancholic autumn. The leaves on the great oaks outside turned brittle and brown, mirroring the way I felt inside. The sickness in my stomach, which I had initially tried to dismiss as a lingering echo of that night's horror, did not fade. It grew, a constant, roiling reminder. 2 months after the library, the sickness was no longer a symptom of fear, but an undeniable, biological fact. I was pregnant. My world, already fractured, collapsed into a single, horrifying point of existence. The knowledge was a lead weight in my gut, dragging me down into a despair so profound I could barely breathe. For days, I lived with the secret alone, a cold, hard stone in my chest. Each morning, I would look at my reflection and see a stranger, a girl whose future had been erased. Finally, clinging to a desperate, foolish sliver of hope, I chose to tell my mother. I thought that somewhere beneath the layers of silent compliance there must be a mother, a woman who would protect her daughter. I found her in the sunroom, arranging flowers in a vase, her movements precise and detached. I waited until she had clipped the last stem, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Mother," I began, my voice a pathetic, reedy whisper. She turned, a mild, questioning look on her face. The words tumbled out of me, clumsy and ugly. I told her everything. Her reaction was not what I had hoped for. There was no surge of maternal rage, no comforting embrace. Her face, usually a placid mask, crumpled. But it was not the face of a mother whose child has been savaged. It was the face of a woman whose carefully ordered world has been threatened with chaos. She didn't look at me with sympathy. She looked at me with terror. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were not for me. They were for the family name, for the scandal, for the disruption this would cause to her quiet, predictable life. She simply wept, her hands fluttering uselessly in the air. Then, without a word to me, she took my arm in a surprisingly firm grip and led me from the sunroom, through the silent house, to the one place I feared more than any other, my father's study. She knocked once on the heavy oak door before pushing it open and nudging me inside, a lamb being delivered for slaughter. I stood before Alistair's massive mahogany desk, a sinner at the pulpit of her judge. The room smelled of old books, leather, and the faint, acrid scent of his cigar smoke. He was sitting in his high-backed chair, a formidable silhouette against the window. He didn't look up at first, continuing to read a document before him. My mother's choked sobs were the only sound in the room. Finally, he placed the paper down and folded his hands, his cold gray eyes pinning me to the spot. "Eleanor, what is the meaning of this display?" he asked, his voice devoid of any warmth. My mother couldn't speak, so I did. Trembling, I told him. I watched his face with the intensity of a condemned prisoner watching their executioner, expecting a storm of rage, a violent eruption that would at least be an honest reaction to the horror of what I'd said. Instead, I saw something far more terrifying. A chilling, unnatural calm settled over his features. There was no anger, no shock, just a flicker of something sharp and calculating in his eyes. He wasn't looking at me, the daughter who had just confessed a nightmare. He was looking through me, at an idea, at a possibility. He was a chess master who had just been presented with an unexpected but potentially advantageous move. He was silent for a full minute, the quiet stretching until it was a physical pressure in the room. Then he spoke, his voice as dry and brittle as old paper. "Silas has been foolish," he said, the word foolish a grotesque understatement that made my blood run cold. It was a dismissal, as if his son had merely tracked mud on a clean carpet. "But," he continued, leaning forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with that strange, feverish light, "the blood is pure. The blood is Walker blood." He looked from my face to my stomach, and I felt like a piece of livestock being appraised. This child is a Walker. It is a continuation of the line. An unplanned one, but a continuation nonetheless. He stood up and began to pace behind his desk, his steps measured and deliberate. "You will carry it. You will deliver it. It is your duty to this family to see that the bloodline remains clean and unbroken." There was no mention of the violence, of the violation. There was no comfort, no justice. There was only the cold, hard calculus of lineage. Silas was not punished. He was not even to be confronted. His name was spoken once and then dismissed. The crime was erased, and in its place, a duty was created. My duty, my sentence. I stood there mute and shaking, as my father, the great Alistair Walker, the pillar of community integrity, laid out the terms of my life sentence. My silence was no longer a product of my fear. It was now a command. My body was no longer my own. It was a vessel for the family's twisted legacy. My life was over. I was 16 years old, and I had just been sentenced to a lifetime of imprisonment within the very walls that were meant to be my home. The key had been turned, the lock had clicked shut, and the silence that followed was the most deafening sound I had ever heard. The child, when he came, arrived as secretly as a sin. He was born in this house, in the dead of a rain-swept night, with only the frantic whispers of a midwife and the cold, orchestrating presence of my father as witnesses. The midwife's hands were skilled, but her eyes were full of a fear that my father's money had purchased and sealed. They named him Daniel. The name felt solid, biblical, a stone dropped into the deep well of my life. It was a name chosen by Alistair to lend credence to the grand, monstrous lie that was about to be constructed. He was not presented to the world as my son. He was the miracle baby, the late surprising gift to Alistair and Eleanor Walker. My brother. The architecture of that deception was my father's magnum opus, and the psychological torment it inflicted was a masterpiece of casual cruelty. I was its primary subject. The world saw a devoted older sister, doting on her new baby brother. Only I, my mother, my father, and Silas knew the truth. My life became a series of fractured moments, each one a small, sharp betrayal of my own body and soul. I would sit in the rocking chair in the nursery, the very room that should have been a sanctuary, and nurse my own son. His small, perfect mouth would latch on, his warmth seeping into me, and for a fleeting, beautiful second, the universe would right itself. I was a mother. He was my child. Then, I would see a shadow in the doorway. It was always Silas. He never had to say a word. He would just lean against the frame, arms crossed, a look of triumphant ownership on his face. It was the look of a collector admiring his most prized and broken possession. Sometimes he would saunter in, his presence sucking the air from the room. He'd peer into the cradle, his face a mask of fraternal affection. "He's got the Walker eyes, doesn't he?" he'd murmur, his voice smooth as poison. He'd reach down and let Daniel's tiny hand curl around his finger. "Look at that grip. He's going to be strong, like his big brother." He would look up at me then, a glint in his eye, daring me to react, to scream, to shatter the porcelain reality they had built around me. But I never did. My silence was the price of Daniel's legitimacy. One afternoon, Silas came in while I was humming a lullaby, one my own mother had hummed to me. He listened for a moment, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. "You're a natural at this, Freya," he said, his voice a low caress that made my skin crawl. "It's almost as if he were your own." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. My humming stopped. The only sound was the gentle sucking of the baby at my breast. I couldn't look at him. I could only stare down at Daniel's head, at the soft, downy hair, and pray for Silas to leave. He was testing the bars of my cage, rattling them to enjoy the sound. My mother, Eleanor, was a different kind of tormentor. She was the ghost of what a mother should have been. She taught me how to care for Daniel, her lessons a pantomime of maternal guidance. Her hands would cover mine, showing me how to test the temperature of the bathwater, how to fold a diaper, how to swaddle him just so. But her touch was cold, mechanical. Her eyes never met mine. They would fix on the wall, on the window, on the tiny, squirming body of the baby between us. "You must support his head, Freya," she'd say, her voice flat, devoid of any warmth. "Babies are more fragile than they look." Her words were never about the baby. They were about me. She was teaching me how to handle the evidence of her own failure, the living, breathing proof that she had not protected me. Each lesson was an unspoken accusation. "You did this. Now you must manage it. You broke. Now you must care for the pieces." One evening, as she showed me how to mix his formula, my milk had started to dry up, a mercy I chalked up to sheer terror. She paused, her hand hovering over the bottle. "Alistair is pleased," she said, not looking at me. "The town believes it. Mrs. Gable from the post office said it was a blessing, a true gift from God in our autumn years." She stirred the powder into the warm water, clinking the spoon against the glass. It is important that everyone continues to believe it. For Daniel's sake. For Daniel's sake. That became the mantra of our house. The justification for every clipped conversation, every averted gaze, every moment I had to stand by and watch the man who had destroyed my girlhood play the part of a loving brother to my son. The years began to bleed into one another, marked not by calendars, but by Daniel's growth. The seasons of my life were measured in his milestones, each one a fresh twist of the knife. His first steps, taken towards me, his arms outstretched. He didn't call for Mama. He gurgled, "Freya," and I had to clap and praise him for getting my name right. My heart splintered, but my face smiled. His first day of school, holding my hand and Silas's hand as we walked him to the gates. The other parents saw a perfect family tableau, the handsome, doting older brother, the gentle older sister. Silas squeezed my hand, a gesture that looked protective to the outside world, but felt like a manacle to me. "Smile, Freya," he'd whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "You look so morose." People will talk. The gaslighting was the very air we breathed in that house. It was constant, methodical, and designed to make me question my own sanity. Any sign of my deep, abiding sorrow was dismissed as theatrics. At a family dinner celebrating Daniel's 8th birthday, I found myself unable to eat, a knot of grief lodged in my throat. My father looked at me from the head of the table, his fork poised. "Freya," he said, his voice low and sharp. "Must you always be so dramatic? This is a happy occasion. You are upsetting your mother." My mother, of course, said nothing. She just picked at her green beans, her face a blank mask. Any attempt I made to create distance from Silas was twisted into a sign of my own flawed character. When I would make an excuse to not attend a town function with him, my mother would corner me later in the hall. "You're being ungrateful, Freya. Silas has done so much for this family. He provides. He protects our name." The least you could do is show him some respect. His protection. His provision. It was all built on the bedrock of my silence. The house itself felt complicit, its thick walls absorbing 2 decades of unspoken screams. I was a ghost haunting the hallways of my own life, my existence defined entirely by the secret I was forced to keep. When I was 25, a flicker of defiance ignited within me. I had taken up sewing, telling my parents it was a hobby to pass the time, but secretly, I took on small mending jobs for a dressmaker in town, stashing the cash, $1 here, 50 cents there, in a loose-leafed copy of Wuthering Heights. It took me nearly 2 years, but I finally saved enough for a one-way bus ticket to a city 3 states away, a place where no one knew the name Walker. The day I bought it, my hands trembled as I slid the money to the clerk. The ticket felt like a sunbeam in my pocket, a tangible promise of a life where I could breathe. I planned to leave in a week, on a Tuesday morning when my father was at his club and my mother was at her garden society meeting. I would leave a note, a vague, polite note, and I would be gone. I would find a job. I would build a life. And maybe, someday, I would find a way to reach out to Daniel to explain. But my father saw everything. He was a hawk, and he had noticed the subtle shift in me, the tiny spark of hope in my eyes that had been extinguished for so long. The day before I was set to leave, I came home to find him waiting for me in his study. He wasn't angry. He never yelled. That was not his way. His cruelty was a cold, quiet thing. He was sitting in his large leather chair, and on the polished mahogany of his desk, stark against the dark wood, was my bus ticket. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen in the doorway. "Sit down, Freya," he said calmly, gesturing to the chair opposite him. I sat, my body numb. He didn't look at me. He looked at the ticket. "I understand the impulse," he began, his voice measured, as if discussing a business transaction. "This life has not been what you might have chosen, but we do not always get to choose our path. We must fulfill our duties." He folded his hands on the desk. "I want you to consider the consequences of this action. Not for you, not for me, for the boy." He finally looked at me, his eyes like chips of ice. "If you walk out that door, you will force my hand. I will have no choice but to protect the family name, and the only way to do that in the face of such a scandal would be to control the narrative. He paused, letting the silence stretch. I will ensure that Daniel knows the sordid truth of his conception. I will explain to him that the woman he knew as his sister is, in fact, his mother, a woman so shameful she abandoned him for her own selfish desires. And the town will know you as something far worse. They will know you as a whore who foisted her illegitimate child upon her own parents. Daniel's life here will be over. He will carry that stain with him forever. He will never be a Walker. He will be the town's dirty secret. He picked up the bus ticket between his thumb and forefinger. Or, you can stay. You can continue your duty. And he can have a life of respect, of opportunity. He can be the heir to a name that means something in this world. He didn't have to raise his voice. He had found the one chain that could hold me more securely than any iron lock. My love for my son. He trapped me with it, turning my most natural, maternal instinct into the very walls of my prison. I looked at his cold, resolute face and knew I had lost. The tiny spark of hope in me died, and this time I knew it would not be reignited. Alistair died on a Tuesday morning in April, when I was 42. He died in his sleep, his face as stern and unyielding in death as it had ever been in life. There was no struggle. He simply ceased to be. When my mother found him, there was a strange quiet in the house, a stillness that felt less like grief and more like a held breath. My first feeling was not sorrow, but a dizzying, hollow sense of vertigo. The warden was gone. But the prison remained, and I knew instantly that Silas, now the undisputed patriarch, would simply take up the keys. The task of clearing out his study fell to me. Silas was too busy with arrangements and greeting the endless stream of condolence bearers. My mother had retreated into a state of bewildered fragility, drifting through the house like a pale moth. So I was the one who had to enter that chamber of power, the room that had always smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and my father's quiet, suffocating authority. For days, I sorted through his life, neatly filed and catalogued. Property deeds, stock certificates, correspondence. It was the biography of a man written in ledgers and legal documents. On the third day, I was dusting the vast built-in bookshelf that covered one wall. I ran my cloth over a row of leather-bound classics, and my fingers snagged on one. A volume of Emerson's essays. It didn't sit quite flush with the others. Curious, I pulled it out. It came away with a strange, hollow sound, and I saw that the back was cut out. Behind it, the dark wood of the shelf looked different. I pressed on it. With a soft click, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a dark, dusty cavity. And inside, sitting like a malevolent heart in the darkness, was a box. It was heavy, made of black iron, bound with ornate, tarnished brass. The lock was a complex, floral monstrosity, rusted and formidable. It was old. It felt ancient, like something that held not just papers, but secrets forged in a different century. My heart began to beat a little faster. This was something different. This felt like it belonged only to my father's most private world, a world even Silas might not have known. I managed to heave it out. It was heavier than I expected, dense with the weight of its own mystery. I carried it into the main room of the study, setting it on his desk where the bus ticket had lain all those years ago. My mother drifted in then, holding a teacup. She saw the box and her face went pale. "What is that?" "I found it behind the bookshelf," I said. "Do you have a key for it?" She stared at it, a flicker of something, fear perhaps, in her vacant eyes. "No, I've never seen it before. Your father had his private things. Put it back, Freya. It's best to let some things lie." Just then, Silas strode in, all self-importance in his dark morning suit. He saw the box and scoffed. "What's this? More of the old man's junk?" He rapped his knuckles on the iron. It made a dull, solid thud. "Probably just old land grants from the 1800s. Worthless. We'll have a locksmith deal with it when we have time." He reached for it, intending to shove it into a corner. But an instinct I didn't know I possessed surged through me. I put my hand on the box, stopping him. "I'll take care of it," I said, my voice steady. He gave me a strange, dismissive look, the kind one gives a child who has become sentimentally attached to a worthless object. "Suit yourself," he shrugged, and turned his attention to a stack of sympathy cards. That night, when the house was finally quiet, I performed my first true act of rebellion. I wrapped the iron box in an old wool blanket, muffling any sound. It was a struggle, its weight a dead, uncooperative burden. I half-dragged, half-carried it to my own room, to the deep, cavernous closet where my life had been stored away for decades. I pushed aside old dresses I would never wear and winter coats that hadn't seen a winter in years, and I hid the box at the very back, behind a forgotten hat box. For decades it sat there. Through the long, quiet years that followed. Through my mother's own peaceful passing, an event that felt more like a slow fade than a sudden departure. Through Daniel's college graduation, his wedding, the birth of his own children, my grandchildren, who knew me only as their polite, distant great-aunt Freya. He kept his distance, a respectful, formal space between us that was the sad, inevitable echo of the lie we lived. He was a good man, but a stranger. He sent cards on holidays and called me twice a year, our conversations full of a polite affection that couldn't bridge the chasm of what he didn't know. Meanwhile, Silas thrived. He became the pride of Havenwood. State Senator Walker. His public image was as pristine and polished as our father's legacy, a legacy built on the foundations of my ruin. Seeing his face on television, hearing him speak of family values and integrity was like swallowing glass. Then last week, he came to visit. He didn't call ahead. He simply appeared at the door one afternoon, looking immaculate in a tailored suit, smelling of power and expensive cologne. He walked into the living room and sat in our father's chair as if it were a throne he had rightfully inherited. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't come to reminisce. He came with an agenda. He placed a glossy brochure on the coffee table between us. "Freya," he began, his voice smooth and reasonable, the voice he used with his constituents. "I've been thinking about your future, your comfort and security. This house, it's far too much for one person." My eyes fell to the brochure. It showed smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard. The name on the front was Havenwood Meadows Assisted Living. "I've taken the liberty of touring it," he continued, oblivious to the ice forming in my veins. "It's a wonderful, secure facility. A private room, lovely gardens, 24-hour care. You'll be safe there. You won't have to worry about a thing." He let that sink in before delivering the final blow. "And it will free us up to deal with the estate properly. A developer has made a very generous offer on this house, the ancestral home." He smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. "It's time to let go of the past, Freya. Turn this asset into something for the future." He was erasing me. This was it. The final, bureaucratic burial. He would sell my prison, liquidate the crime scene, and tuck me away in a clean, quiet room where I could fade into nothing. He was going to wipe the slate clean, and me along with it. As he spoke, his voice, so full of false concern about my comfort and safety, began to merge with another voice from the past. It was the same condescending, proprietary tone he had used in the nursery, the same voice that had whispered threats in the guise of brotherly advice. He was still the master of my life, still dictating the terms of my existence. And in that moment, something shifted. Decades of compressed silence, of swallowed grief and rage, reached a critical mass. I thought of the box, the heavy iron box hidden in the back of my closet. It wasn't just a question mark anymore. It was a dense metallic weight in my mind, an anchor. And I knew, with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was liberating, that my silence had run its course. It was no longer a shield for my son. It was the last chain holding me down. I had to open that box. The phone book felt like an artifact from another era, its pages thin and whispering. I didn't dare use the internet. Silas had once boasted that anything digital left a ghost, a trail that could be followed. I needed a ghost of my own, but one who worked in the physical world, in steel and tumblers. I found what I was looking for under Locksmiths, not in Havenwood, but in a dusty township 2 counties over. A name, a number, no flashy advertisement, just Miller's son, since 1948. Discreet service. The man who answered the phone had a voice like gravel turning in a slow mixer. I explained my predicament in the vaguest possible terms. An old family heirloom, a box, the key long lost. I could hear the faint sound of a metal file scraping in the background. He didn't ask about the contents. He didn't ask why I was calling from so far away. He simply quoted a price and asked for the address. "I can be there Thursday," he said. "Around 10, Thursday." Silas would be in the Capitol, debating some meaningless bill about agricultural subsidies, his voice oozing sincerity for the cameras. The house would be mine. Mr. Miller arrived in a faded blue pickup truck, the logo on the door so weathered it was nearly illegible. He was older than his voice suggested, with hands that looked like they were carved from old oak, stained with a lifetime of oil and rust. His eyes, however, were just as the advertisement promised, discreet. They took in the grand, decaying facade of the Walker house without a flicker of curiosity. He wasn't impressed by wealth, nor was he intrigued by its absence. He was a man who understood that locks existed to keep things in as much as to keep things out. I led him upstairs, my own footsteps echoing on the grand staircase, a sound I'd grown to hate. It always felt like I was announcing my presence to the ghosts. We went to my father's old study, the room I had so diligently aired out, but which still held the faint, cloying scent of his cigars and his authority. The iron box sat on the floor, where I had dragged it, squat and obstinate. It looked less like a container for valuables and more like a miniature coffin. Mr. Miller knelt beside it, his knees cracking softly. He ran a gnarled finger over the rusted lock mechanism. "Old one," he grunted. "A statement of fact, not judgment. Good one, in its day." He set down his worn leather tool bag and opened it. It was not a bag of tricks, but of instruments. He worked with a surgeon's focus, selecting a tension wrench and a series of picks. For 20 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the faint rhythmic clicks of metal on metal and my own breathing, which I struggled to keep even. I sat in my father's high-backed leather chair, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. I was watching a man dismantle the last physical barrier of my prison. With every tiny click, I felt a wire inside me being snipped. He wasn't just picking a lock. He was performing an exorcism. Finally, there was a sound that was different from the others, a solid, definitive thunk. It was not a gunshot, as I had imagined. It was deeper, more final, like a bone setting or breaking. "There you are, ma'am," Mr. Miller said, wiping his hands on a rag. He stood up, his work complete. He didn't glance inside the box. He simply gathered his tools, his gaze fixed on the floor. I paid him in cash, adding a significant amount on top. He counted it once, nodded, and handed me a simple, handwritten receipt. "Pleasure doing business," he said, and then he was gone, his faded blue truck disappearing down the long, winding driveway, leaving no trace he was ever there. I was alone with the open box. For a long time, I just stared at it. The lid was ajar, a dark mouth daring me to look inside. The air that escaped smelled of dry paper and forgotten time. There was no gleam of gold, no rustle of currency. My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, settled into a slow, heavy rhythm. I knelt down, the way the locksmith had, and slowly, with a hand that trembled, I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed velvet, were my father's journals. Not the official, leather-bound volumes he kept on the library shelves, filled with notes on business and local politics. These were smaller, bound in soft, faded calfskin, the kind a man keeps for his private thoughts. There were 5 of them. Beneath them, a single, stiff manila folder. My fingers went to the folder first. It felt cold, clinical. The label was typewritten, the ink faded to a pale gray. Portland Diagnostic Clinic, it read, followed by a date. A date from the year before Silas was born. A lifetime ago. I opened it. Inside, there was a single sheet of heavy bond paper. It was a medical report. My eyes scanned a sea of technical terms I didn't understand, abbreviations and figures. And then I saw it. A single word, underlined in red ink by a doctor's pen 67 years ago. A word I had never seen before, but whose meaning I understood with soul-shattering instinct. Diagnosis. aspermia. And below it, a brutal parenthetical clarification. Complete and irreversible sterility. Subject is incapable of producing viable spermatozoa. The paper fell from my fingers. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. A strange glacial calm spread through my veins, freezing the storm that had raged inside me for decades. Alistair Walker, the patriarch, the man who spoke of bloodlines as if they were holy scripture, the man who had built my cage to protect the purity of his lineage. He could not father children. I sank back on my heels, the room tilting around me. The truth was not a key unlocking a door. It was a wrecking ball, and it had just swung through the entire foundation of my life, demolishing everything, every sacrifice, every tear, every silent scream swallowed in the dark. Silas was not his son, and I was not his daughter. We were props, adopted props perhaps, brought in to play a part in his grand, desperate play. The entire mythology of the Walker name, the sacred, unbroken line stretching back through generations, the very concept for which I had been offered up like a ritual sacrifice on the altar of family honor. It was all a fraud, a lie. The pathetic, elaborate fiction of an impotent man, terrified of being forgotten, a man obsessed with a legacy he was biologically incapable of creating. My abuse, my imprisonment, Daniel's very existence. It wasn't to preserve a bloodline, it was to perpetuate a lie. Alistair hadn't sacrificed me for the family name. He had sacrificed me for his own fragile pride. He hadn't seen Silas's crime as a stain on our heritage. He'd seen it as a grotesque, horrific, but ultimately convenient opportunity. A child of my blood, a child of his wife's blood, born in his house, under his name. The line continues. My line. I picked up the journals, my movements slow, deliberate. I had the weapon. Now, I needed the ammunition. A day drifted by in a haze of revelation, the world outside my window muted and distant. Then, 2 days after Mr. Miller's visit, the mail carrier's truck rumbled up the drive and deposited a single thick envelope into the tarnished brass mailbox. Its weight felt significant, important. I slid it open with a kitchen knife. The card inside was embossed in gold leaf, ridiculously ostentatious. The Havenwood Historical Society cordially invites you to the annual Founders Gala. My breath caught. It wasn't just any gala. This year, the guest of honor, the recipient of their Legacy Award, was my brother. Senator Silas Walker, honored for his family's century of unwavering contribution to the town of Havenwood. It was perfect. It was diabolical. A stage built on a foundation of quicksand, and they were about to hand the starring role to the architect of its ruin. My ruin. I looked at the RSVP card, the phone number for the event organizer gleaming up at me. My hand was steady as I picked up the receiver. A woman's voice answered, bright and chirpy, the kind of voice that has never known a true shadow. Founders Gala, this is Brenda speaking. Hello, Brenda, I said, my own voice sounding foreign in the silent kitchen. It was calm, measured. My name is Freya Walker. I'm calling to RSVP. There was a moment of surprised silence, then an audible gasp of delight. Miss Walker! Oh my goodness! We are so thrilled. We had sent the invitation, of course, but we didn't dare hope. Silas, the senator, will be absolutely overjoyed. Your presence will mean the world to him. A smile, thin and sharp as a shard of glass, touched my lips. It felt alien, a muscular contraction I hadn't used in years. Oh, I'm sure it will, I said, the words dripping with an icy sincerity that was lost on her. I wouldn't miss it for anything. Wonderful. We'll have you seated at the head table, of course, right beside your brother. It will be such a perfect picture of family. Yes, I murmured, looking at the open journal on the table. A picture? That sounds about right. After I hung up, the silence of the house returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of secrets. It was the charged, humming silence of a hunter waiting in a blind. The week that followed was a blur of focused obsession. I did not clean. I did not garden. I barely ate. I lived at the kitchen table with my father's ghosts. I consumed his journals, devouring 60 years of his private thoughts, his fears, his pathetic rationalizations. I became an archaeologist of my own family's ruin. I cross-referenced dates, matching his scripted entries about business trips with the hidden appointments at the Portland Clinic. I read his flowery prose about the weight of heritage and saw it for what it was, the desperate scaffolding of a man terrified of his own nothingness. I found the entry from the night my mother, tear-streaked and trembling, had brought me before him. He hadn't written of shame or anger. He had written of salvation. "The boy's sin can be my salvation," the spidery script read. "A child of my wife's blood, born in my house." The line continues. My line. He had capitalized my. I read it over and over until the words lost all meaning and became a mere mantra of madness. I wasn't just planning to tell the truth. I was preparing to perform an autopsy, to lay the desiccated corpse of the Walker family name out on a slab in front of the whole town and dissect it, piece by rotten piece. I memorized passages. I rehearsed them in the empty rooms, my voice gaining strength with each recitation. I was no longer a victim preparing to speak out. I was an executioner, sharpening my axe. The afternoon of the gala arrived with a sky the color of a dull bruise. The air was heavy, charged with the promise of a storm. My preparations were almost complete. There was just one last pilgrimage to make. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I walked to the end of the upstairs hall and turned the key in the lock of the porcelain room. The door swung inward with a protesting groan, releasing a gust of stale, trapped air that smelled of dust and decay. They were all there, sitting on their velvet-lined shelves, an army of blank-faced children frozen in time. Their vacant glass eyes stared back at me, a silent, judging chorus representing the flawless, fragile purity I was supposed to embody. My father had loved these dolls. He called them emblems of our family's perfect, uninterrupted femininity. I walked to the central shelf. My eyes fell on the largest, most ornate doll, the one he had called the matriarch. She wore a gown of faded silk and lace, her porcelain face delicately painted, her blonde curls immaculate. According to the family mythos Alistair had so carefully constructed, she was a priceless heirloom brought over from Germany by our great-grandmother in the 1880s, the cornerstone of the collection. His journal told a different story. Found a splendid German doll at an antique shop in Portland today. He had written in a 1955 entry. "Exquisite craftsmanship. It will make a fine anchor for the family narrative I am building for the children." History is not what happens. It is the story we agree to tell. Another lie. The most celebrated piece of our history was a $50 purchase from a secondhand store. I reached out and took the matriarch from her shelf. She was cold and heavy in my hands, a beautiful, empty fraud, the perfect symbol. Clutching the doll, I went back to the kitchen and picked up the phone. I dialed Daniel's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar, a sound that always managed to both soothe and ache in my heart. "Freya, is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Daniel," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need you to listen to me." "What is it? You sound strange." "There are things you don't know, Daniel. Things about our family, about your grandfather, Alistair." I paused, choosing my words with surgical care. "Things that change everything. I need you to watch the news tonight. The local channel. They'll be covering the Founders Gala." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his concern mounting, turning into a familiar, anxious dread. "Freya, what are you going to do? Don't cause a scene, please. For my sake." It was the plea he had been conditioned to make his entire life. "Don't make waves. Don't upset the order of things. Don't bring shame upon the house." For 65 years I had obeyed. But the house was a lie, and my shame had been a cage. "A scene is all I have left, Daniel," I told him, my voice soft but unyielding. It was the truest thing I had ever said. And before he could argue, before he could plead anymore, I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle, cutting the last tie to my life of silence. The Havenwood Grand Ballroom was a symphony of denial. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables groaning with food and wine. The town's elite, dressed in their finest, moved through the room with the practiced ease of people who believed their own press. Their laughter was brittle, their smiles stretched tight. I felt like a ghost at their feast, an omen they refused to see. I had chosen a simple black dress, the one I wore to my mother's funeral. I sat alone at the front table they had so graciously reserved for me, an empty seat beside me where Silas would later sit. People glanced my way, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and curiosity. The crazy old spinster, Freya Walker, finally emerged from her decaying mansion. They whispered, I'm sure, about my fragility. I let them. I nursed a glass of water, the ice cubes clinking like tiny distant bells. I felt nothing, not fear, not anger, not even anticipation, just a profound, unnerving calm. I held the heavy porcelain doll in my lap, wrapped in a silk scarf, a sleeping child waiting for her cue. Then he arrived. The room erupted in applause as Senator Silas Walker made his entrance. He was in his element, a silver-haired god descending from on high. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands, clapping backs, his smile as bright and false as a searchlight. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. There was a flicker of surprise, then irritation, quickly masked by his public face. He gave me a curt, dismissive nod before turning to accept the adulation of the mayor. He saw me as a minor inconvenience, a strange footnote at his celebration. He had no idea he was looking at his doom. He eventually took his seat beside me. Freya, he said, his voice a low, warning hiss under the cover of the applause. What in God's name are you doing here? I was invited, I said simply, my gaze fixed on the stage, to celebrate our family's legacy. He grunted, mollified for the moment. The speeches began. Long, rambling tributes from people who had benefited from the Walker name for generations. They spoke of Alistair's vision, of his integrity, of the unbroken chain of civic duty. With every word, the foundation of the stage became more rotten, more precarious. Finally, it was Silas's turn. He strode to the podium, basking in the standing ovation. He looked out at the sea of adoring faces, his expression a perfect blend of humility and power. My friends, he began, his voice smooth and practiced, resonating with manufactured warmth. My neighbors, to stand here tonight, accepting this award on behalf of the Walker family, is the greatest honor of my life. I stand on the shoulders of giants, most notably my father, Alistair Walker, a man who taught me that legacy is not about wealth or power. It is about something far more precious. It is about heritage. It's about the purity of purpose, the strength of a clean and honest bloodline, a sacred trust passed down from one generation to the next. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of his sanctimonious words settle over the rapt audience. That was my cue. I stood up. The scraping of my chair was the only sound in the cavernous room. I unwrapped the doll from its silk shroud and walked toward the stage. A hush fell. Every head turned. The sea of faces became a single, staring eye. I could feel Silas's smile falter. I saw the confusion in his eyes turn to a cold, sharp alarm. I didn't run. I didn't rush. I ascended the 3 short steps to the stage as if I belonged there. I stopped a few feet from him, the warmth of the stage lights on my face. I didn't need the microphone. My voice, for the first time in my life, was strong enough. I held up my father's journal. This is the private diary of Alistair Walker, I announced, my voice carrying to the very back of the ballroom. It was clear and steady, devoid of tremor. My brother speaks of legacy. I think it's time you all knew the truth of his. The truth our father would have wanted you to know. Silas took a step toward me, his face a mask of fury. Freya, sit down. You're making a fool of yourself. I ignored him, opening the journal to a page marked with a dried flower. An entry from October 17th, 1952, I read, my voice ringing with clarity, from the Portland Diagnostic Clinic. Diagnosis, aspermia, complete and irreversible sterility. My father, Alistair Walker, could not have children. A collective gasp went through the room. a sudden intake of breath, like the tide being sucked out from shore. I turned the page to the second marker. And an entry from the night of August 22nd, 1960, the night I told him I was pregnant. I looked directly at Silas, letting him see the absolute certainty in my eyes. He wrote, "The boy's sin can be my salvation. A child of my wife's blood, born in my house. The line continues. My line." Silas's face had gone from red to a waxy, bloodless white. He looked like a statue cracking from the inside out. "He knew you weren't his son," I said, my voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more damning. "He knew you were no more a Walker by blood than I was. And he let you do what you did to me, because my shame gave him an heir." I finally turned my gaze from my brother to the stunned, silent audience. I let them see the 60 years of pain in my eyes. "Daniel," I said, my voice breaking for just a moment before it solidified again into steel. "The man you all know as my younger brother. He is my son, born of rape. At the hands of the man you are honoring tonight." A wave of shock and horror rolled through the crowd. Someone screamed. Others just stared, their mouths agape. Then, I held up the porcelain doll, the matriarch, the beautiful fraud. I held her high for everyone to see. "This," I declared, my voice soaring over the chaos, "is the Walker family legacy. A beautiful lie, bought at a shop, and designed to fool the world." And with all the strength I had, I let it fall. It hit the polished wooden stage with a sound that was not a crash, but an explosion. A sharp, violent shattering that echoed louder than any gunshot, louder than any scream. The sound of a dynasty, a century of lies, and a lifetime of silence, all breaking at once. The porcelain shards skittered across the stage, glittering like jagged fallen stars under the hot, unforgiving lights. The sound of the porcelain doll shattering on the polished oak stage was not loud. It was a sharp, crystalline crack, a sound so precise and finite that it sliced through the murmuring of the crowd and left behind a vacuum of perfect, ringing silence. For a single suspended heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. The world seemed to hold its breath with me, listening to the echo of that one small, decisive act of destruction. Then, the vacuum imploded. It started with a single gasp, then another, and then the air erupted into a cacophony of noise. Camera flashes began to strobe like a violent man-made lightning storm, each burst of light searing Silas's face into my memory. His expression was not one of rage, not yet. It was one of pure, uncomprehending shock. The carefully constructed mask of the Honorable Senator Walker had been ripped away, and what was left was just a man, pale and suddenly small, staring at the scattered, glittering fragments of his life on the floor. The microphone he held started to emit a low hum, forgotten in his grasp. People were shouting, not just reporters, but the town's elite, the men and women in their starched shirts and silk gowns, who had come to celebrate a legacy I had just doused in kerosene and lit ablaze. Their faces were a gallery of confusion, horror, and a dawning, predatory excitement. I saw Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, clutch at her pearls, her mouth a perfect O of scandalized delight. I saw Mr. Henderson, whose family had vied with the Walkers for social dominance for a century, wear a slow, reptilian smile. They weren't seeing a victim or a monster on that stage. They were seeing a story, the story of the year. 2 security guards, their own faces tight with uncertainty, moved towards me. They didn't grab me. Their touch was hesitant, almost gentle, as if they weren't sure if I was a culprit to be apprehended or a relic to be handled with care. They flanked me, creating a small, moving bubble of quiet as they guided me off the side of the stage, away from Silas, who still stood frozen, a statue in the eye of a hurricane. I didn't look back at him. I had said my piece. The rest was just noise. The walk through the grand hall was a blur of distorted faces and outstretched phones, all recording my exit. The guards moved with practiced efficiency, murmuring, "Excuse me, ma'am, please step aside," carving a path through the chaos. I felt strangely disconnected from it all, as if I were watching a film about someone else. A profound, almost unnerving calm had settled deep within my bones. I had spent a lifetime containing an ocean of rage and grief behind a dam of silence. Now that the dam was broken, all that was left was the quiet, empty basin. I had become the bomb, just as I'd planned. This was the fallout. Outside, the cool night air was a relief. The guards escorted me to a waiting town car, one I hadn't summoned. One of them spoke, his voice low and respectful. "Where to, Mrs. Walker?" Mrs. Walker. The name felt like a costume I was still wearing. "Home," I said, my own voice sounding distant. "Just take me home." The drive back to the house on the hill was silent. The city light smeared past the window, a river of gold and red. The house was dark as I approached, a familiar monolith waiting to swallow me back up. But as the car pulled away, leaving me standing on the gravel driveway, I knew it was different. For 60 years, this house had been my prison, its silence curated by fear. Tonight, it felt like a fortress, the only place on earth the storm of my own making couldn't touch. The days that followed bled into one another, marked not by the sun and moon, but by the relentless assault of the outside world. The telephone began ringing the morning after the gala and did not stop. I never answered it. I let the machine take the messages, its robotic voice a bizarre counterpoint to the flood of human emotion. Reporters, old family friends demanding an explanation, producers from morning talk shows offering me a platform to tell my story. I unplugged it from the wall on the second day. The silence that filled its absence was a mercy. Then came the mail. It arrived in torrents, overflowing the old brass mail slot and piling up on the foyer floor. It was a physical manifestation of the world's judgment. I would sit in the living room, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, and read through the pile, sorting my life into two neat stacks: condemnation and communion. The hate mail was visceral, penned in angry, slashing script, or typed in cold, anonymous fonts. "You are a vile, bitter old woman, tearing down a good man to get attention." One letter, on expensive stationery I recognized as belonging to a family my father used to play golf with, called me a disgrace. Alistair would be spinning in his grave. Family matters are meant to be handled with dignity and privacy, not aired out like dirty laundry for the vultures to feast upon. You have destroyed not just your brother, but the Walker name itself. You are a monster. I read each one, feeling the venom, the outrage, the terror of people whose own carefully constructed worlds felt threatened by my truth. They weren't just defending Silas. They were defending the very idea of secrets, the silent agreements that hold their own gilded cages together. But for every letter of hate, there was another of a different sort. These were often anonymous, written on simple, plain paper. Some were just a few words. "Thank you. I believe you. You are not alone." One envelope contained no letter at all, only a pressed violet, the kind that grew wild in the less tended corners of Havenwood. Another came with a newspaper clipping of Silas, his face ashen as he was mobbed by reporters, with a single triumphant word scrawled across his image: "Finally." These letters were from the other ghosts, the other silent women. They were notes from a secret sisterhood I never knew I had. Each one was a small, steady light in the vast darkness. I hadn't just spoken for myself on that stage. I had given voice to the whispers in 1,000 other walls. I kept these notes in a small wooden box on the mantelpiece. The hate mail. I burned. Each evening, I would take the day's pile to the fireplace, and I would watch the angry words curl into black ash and float up the chimney. I had torched the great, ancient forest of my family's legacy, a forest grown from lies and watered with my tears. I stood now in the scorched, silent clearing, surrounded by echoes and ashes, and I did not yet know what, if anything, would ever grow in its place. I only knew that for the first time in my life, the ground was clear. The knock on the door came on what I think was the 7th day. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a reporter or the polite tap of a delivery man. It was a solid, hesitant sound, a sound I had known my entire life. I knew it was Daniel before I even reached the door. I opened it, and we stood there, suspended in the silence of the doorway. The outline from the news reports was right. He looked a decade older. The easy confidence he'd always carried, the effortless charm that was so much a part of him, was gone. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes were bloodshot and shadowed with the exhaustion so deep it seemed to have settled into his bones. He was wearing the same suit I'd seen him in on television, now rumpled and tired. He looked like a man who had been wandering for a week, lost. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, his gaze filled with a universe of confusion and pain. I stepped aside and he walked into the house, into the living room, the space where he had grown up playing on the floor, believing I was his sister. The air between us was thick and heavy, charged with a lifetime of unspoken, unacknowledged truth. He didn't pace. He didn't shout. He just sank into my father's old armchair, the one Alistair had always sat in, and stared at his hands. Finally, he looked up at me, his voice a low, ragged whisper. Why? It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. A genuine, desperate question from a man whose entire foundation had been turned to dust. And so, I told him. I didn't sit. I stood by the fireplace, my hand resting on the mantel, on the box of notes from my secret sisters. I told him everything. I started not with the violence, but with the quiet before it. I told him about the summer I was 16, about the scent of honeysuckle and the suffocating weight of my father's expectations. I described Silas, not as the monster he became, but as the brother I once knew, the golden boy whose smile never quite reached his eyes. I spoke of the darkness I sensed in him, a darkness everyone else dismissed as ambition. My voice was steady, almost detached, as I recounted the act itself. I spared him the most graphic details, but I did not spare him the truth of the manipulation. I told him Silas's words, how he'd twisted our shared blood into something sacred and perverse, how he had called it our duty to the Walker line. I told him of the terror, and then the deeper, more profound terror of the silence that followed. I told him about telling our mother, about her silent, weeping collapse, about the walk to Alistair's study. I described our father's reaction, the terrifying, reptilian calm, the cold, calculating look in his eyes as he saw not a family tragedy, but a dynastic opportunity. I spoke his decree aloud, the words that had been my sentence. The child will be born. He will be our son. You will be his sister. Silas will not be punished. The bloodline remains pure. This conversation is over. Daniel didn't flinch. He just sat there, absorbing it all, his face a mask of stone. When I was done with my own story, I walked to the hidden compartment behind the bookshelf and retrieved the old iron box. I placed it on the table in front of him, along with the key. This is the rest of it, I said quietly. This is what he believed he was protecting. I gave him his grandfather's, no, Alistair's journals, and the sterile medical report tucked within them. Then I left him. I went into the kitchen and made a pot of tea I knew neither of us would drink. I could feel him through the walls, a silent, seismic presence in the other room. The hours stretched on. I heard nothing but the rustle of turning pages, a sound as dry as autumn leaves. He was reading the story of a man obsessed with a lie, a man so desperate to preserve the myth of his own potency and the purity of his lineage that he sacrificed his daughter to conceal his own barrenness. He was reading the truth, that Silas and I were not Alistair's children, that the entire Walker legacy was a fraud, that my 60 years of suffering, my stolen motherhood, had all been in service of a ghost. Sometime after dusk, a sound came from the living room. It was a sound I had never heard from him, not even as a small boy who had fallen and scraped his knee. It was the sound of weeping, not a loud, theatrical grief, but a quiet, ragged, hopeless sound. The sound of a man mourning everything at once. He wept for the mother he never knew he had, the woman who had been a ghost in his own home. He wept for the father who was a lie, a cold man who had built his life on a fantasy. He wept for the uncle who was a monster, and for the brother who never was. He wept for the boy he had been, living happily inside a monstrous deception. He wept for himself. I stayed in the kitchen, giving him the dignity of grieving alone. The next day, he emerged from the guest room where he'd finally slept. The shadows were still under his eyes, but something in his posture had changed. The slump of defeat was gone, replaced by a rigid, brittle resolve. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not a son, not a brother, but an equal, an ally. "I'm making a statement to the press today," he said, his voice clear and firm. He didn't ask for my permission. He didn't need it. That afternoon, from the steps of the Havenwood courthouse, he faced the cameras that had been hounding him all week. He didn't speak of Silas. He didn't speak of Alistair. He spoke only of me. He spoke of a mother's love, of a lifetime of silent sacrifice he was only just beginning to comprehend. He stood by me, unequivocally. And then, he delivered the final blow to the name that had cost us both so much. He announced that he was beginning the legal process of changing his name. He was not taking my maiden name, nor a new one I might choose. He was choosing one for himself, one that belonged to no one but him. He was shedding the weight of Walker, the name of the monster who created him and the lie that raised him, and he was stepping into the world as his own man. It was his first true act of freedom. It was the first seed of new life in the ashes. Our relationship now is not simple. It cannot be. Too much time was stolen. Too many truths were buried. There is an awkwardness between us, the caution of two strangers learning to navigate a new and fragile landscape. We are building something new on top of the rubble of the old. It is a tentative, hesitant thing, this new bond between a mother and a son who are only just meeting. But for the first time in our lives, it is real. This morning, the sunlight slanted through the living room windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The house is quiet now. It is a new kind of silence. For decades, the silence in this house was a presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket of secrets. Now, it is simply an absence of noise. It is peace. I was sitting in my usual chair when a small shadow fell over me. I looked up to see Lily, my great-granddaughter, Daniel's granddaughter, standing before me. Her face was serious, her brow furrowed in concentration. In her small, outstretched hand, she held the old, heavy iron key. The key to the porcelain room. I must have left it on the kitchen table after taking out Alistair's journals. "Is this the key, Grandma Freya?" she asked, her voice a sweet, clear bell in the quiet house. "The one for the locked room?" I looked from her bright, innocent face to the dark, rusted iron in her palm. The key to my prison. The key to a lifetime of pain. I reached out and gently closed her fingers around it. I gave her a small smile. "It is," I said, "but the things inside, they aren't fragile anymore." I looked down the long, shadowed hallway towards the closed door at the very end. "You can go in if you like. You can open the windows. It's time to let the air in." Lily's face broke into a grin of pure, childish delight at being given such a grown-up task. She clutched the key tightly, and without another word, turned and ran down the hall, her small feet pattering softly on the wooden floors. I heard the scrape of the heavy key in the old lock, a sound that once would have sent a chill down my spine. Then, the loud, groaning creak of the door opening for the first time in decades without fear or ceremony. I am still 85 years old. I still live in this house in Havenwood. My youth, my motherhood, the years the locusts have eaten, they are not coming back. I know that now. The act I committed on that stage was not about mending the past. Revenge does not mend. It only ends. It draws a final, definitive line. But the truth has a power all its own. It doesn't heal the wounds, but it cleans them. It lets the light and air touch them for the first time. The truth is what broke the lock. The truth is what shattered the dolls. And the truth, in the end, is what set me, and the future running down the hall, free. The silence of this house is no longer a secret. It's a sanctuary. And as I sit here, I think I can feel a faint, fresh breeze, a promise of change, finally making its way through the old, quiet rooms. There are so many stories like mine, hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. How many secrets are kept to protect a name, a legacy, or a lie? And what do you think is the true price of silence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.